Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so we are getting into the first issue of the new volume of New Mutants, and I'm excited about this actually. I'm pretty hyped about this. It really is a good throwback to the old New Mutants comics, but if I'm being honest with you guys, Hickman is writing it, and I love Hickman's writing. This feels more like Generation X than New Mutants, right? It's kind of crazy in terms of how this whole thing goes down. But what this does is this initially picks up with Rain Sinclair, with really like Wolfsbane. Now here's the thing, it's like a really good way to open this. And the reason why is because Wolfsbane is one of the original New Mutants, right? So the way this played out in Marvel Comics, like this is like decades ago, like eons and eons ago. So the way this played out is you had the X-Men, and the X-Men were a really, really popular team. And so Marvel basically came along, and I want to say it was Jim Shooter who went to Louise Simonson and Chris Claremont and said, give me a new X-Men title or a new mutant title. If you don't, I'm gonna have somebody else do it. And so they ended up creating the New Mutants. And the way this played out is, and it was kind of a cool revelation, the way this played out is you had mutants out there who were like usually discovered by Charles Xavier, right? Like he'd put on his Cerebro helmet and he'd look around and say, there's a mutant over there. And then like all the X-Men would go there, or he would go there, whatever the case is, and they would talk to them, and sometimes they would join the X-Men, sometimes they wouldn't, right? They would just say, screw off, I'm gonna go commit crimes, and then like the X-Men would fight them later on or something along those lines. The cool thing about this is that you had Maura McTaggart, and Maura McTaggart was basically just a mutant geneticist at the time. Now Hickman has changed a lot of her character as part of House and Powers of X, but back then she was just a mutant geneticist. But what would happen is that if she came across a mutant who didn't understand how their powers worked, or she didn't understand how their powers worked, she would work alongside them to understand it on a genetic level. There were other times where Xavier would come across a mutant and he wouldn't understand how their powers work. So he would send them to Maura McTaggart, and she would basically, work on them and try to figure out what the case was. It was a cool idea. But Rain Sinclair was a mutant who was basically found by Maura McTaggart and brought in. And then ultimately the New Mutants were formed after that. But the cool thing about this is that Rain Sinclair is one of the many mutants who's been resurrected by the Five. And that's officially what Hickman's calling them now, right? The 5 mutants who were responsible for being able to resurrect mutants. Now, here's the reason why that matters, is because by saying it's the 5, what it does is it makes those 5 mutants essential to the process of resurrection. If any one of those 5 mutants die, the ability to resurrect mutants basically goes away. Like it's effectively gone. And so as a result of that, you need to have them there in order to be able to pull that off. So you kill any one of those 5, and most likely the X-Men cannot resurrect mutants anymore. But as a result of those 5, mutants who have basically been killed off over the years are systematically being brought back, right? So you've got Danielle Moonstar, who basically makes her return. You've got Karma, who makes her return. Karma was an interesting character, right? Technically they call her Shan, and I guess that's really how you pronounce it, but it's X-I-A-N, I think is how it's actually spelled. She had the ability, she had telepathy, and she could possess people, which was really, really cool. Wolfsbane was basically like a little mini werewolf kind of character, right? She could turn into one of those characters that looked like a werewolf. It was kind of cool the way it played out. And then we have the return of Mondo. I don't know why Mondo is back here. Mondo was a terrible character. Okay, so the idea behind this is in the old Generation X comics, right? It was Generation X number 3 in 1995 by Scott Lobdell, and they introduced Mondo as this mutant that had the ability to basically influence or to manipulate any kind of biological organism that was out there, right? So he could interface and like take on the properties of those various things. But Mondo was introduced as a friend of Emma Frost's younger sister, and the younger sister of Emma Frost tried to basically get herself in the Hellfire Club by having him captured. It was weird. Anyway, ultimately they're defeated by Generation X, and the result is that Mondo is brought onto the team. This runs for about 5 years until Jay Faber gets his hands on Generation X. And in 1999 or 2000, I want to say it was February 2000, there was a story that ran in issue 60 and 61. And what you ended up learning is that Mondo, as he existed in Generation X up to that point, was not actually Mondo. It was a clone created by Black Tom Cassidy, who was designed to infiltrate Generation X. And it was basically a clone of the supervillain Mondo, who worked with Black Tom Cassidy. It was weird. It was comics in the late 2000s. Didn't really make a whole lot of sense. The way things are going down here, this looks like the Mondo clone is really kind of what it looks like in terms of like this guy being a good guy and never really being a bad guy. Plus, there's no real reference to him ever having been a villain before. At least that's kind of how it seemed anyway. So regardless of the circumstance, the cool thing about this is that Doug Ramsey, Cypher basically walks up on him and says, hey man, because you can interface with like biological organisms and things along those lines, organic and inorganic matter, see if you can interface with Krakoa, because I want to talk to it. I just want to see if it can happen. And it's kind of weird because ultimately Krakoa does, right? It interfaces directly through Mondo and talks to Doug Ramsey, which is kind of cool, but it's interesting because what it does is it really ties the nature of Mondo, at least seemingly, into plant life, right? The fact remains here that of course you've got Robert DaCosta, who's basically been brought back. You've got Danielle Moonstar, who's here. It really is kind of a reunion with all these new mutants that are here. The only person that's missing is Sam Guthrie as Cannonball, because at the moment he's currently in Shi'ar space. Now in reality, this statement kind of confuses me a little bit. And the reason why is because Paige Guthrie, the sister of Sam, died died during House and Powers of X, right? She was Husk. She was one of the mutants that was killed during the assault on Mother Mold. Icarus has basically been dead since Decimation, right? Since like the aftermath of Decimation and the war with William Stryker. So I have no idea who Sam Guthrie's with. I have no idea who he's with at the moment. It's kind of weird to sort of have that thrown in. So it may just be that it's one of those things where like Icarus was brought back in some form or fashion and then for whatever reason was sent to Shi'ar space. I don't really know, but that's basically where Sam is at the moment. The result is that the New Mutants actually end up hitching a ride with Corsair and the Starjammers. Now, this is cool. I love this idea of the New Mutants working with Corsair and his guys, but the overall gist here, the overall idea behind this is essentially the New Mutants are just screwing stuff up everywhere they go. And it's one of the funny things because what you end up having is Cypher and Mondo, who essentially create one of these Krakoan portals more or less in this biome basically that's ran by Chode. And it's kind of a funny thing because as soon as Chode realizes what's going on, like he realizes there's an imbalance in the various substances that make up this biome, and then when he gets in there, he starts freaking out. And the reason why is because he had basically found, or he had found these little plants that really only bloom once in a decade, right? Like once every 10 years. And he had to get these conditions perfect. So he had to spend years getting these conditions ripe for these flowers to bloom. And then when that happens, it'll take a decade before they reach their final form. And they've been killed by Cypher and and Mondo. Which is kind of funny. That's why I say this feels like Generation X, man. Like that's exactly what it feels. It feels like Generation X. New Mutants was pretty serious at the time, but I think Generation X was a little more carefree in terms of how it was done. It's funny to me because then you end up switching over to Raza and Magic. And here's the funny thing: Raza is not really the muscle of the team, but he kind of is, right? He's the muscle insofar as he's probably the one who's the best at fighting. And the funny thing about this is Magic, of course, having her sword and so on, is a prodigious fighter as well. And so there's kind of a bet that's going on here, right? Between the two of these guys, who's going to win the fight between the two. The idea is that ultimately, if Robert DaCosta wins, then they basically take Kentucky bourbon off of Corsair, which I'm proud to say is cool because I'm from Kentucky. We basically have two bourbons in Kentucky, right? Like two bourbons that matter. You've got Woodford Reserve and you got Buffalo Trace. I'm a Woodford man more so than a Buffalo Trace man, but they're both pretty good, right? So it's kind of cool to see this little bet go on. The funny thing about this is that when this goes down, Raza basically punches Magic in the face. She freaks out and then like breaks his sword in half and cuts off his robotic arm. So like these little moments, you need to kind of remember this for a second because it'll become important once we get closer to the end of the story. But what they end up doing is arriving at the space station Benevolence. Now here's the important thing to understand about Shi'ar space. Shi'ar space is very much akin to like Kree space or Skrull space, where it's a huge section of the universe, or really of a particular galaxy that's kind of cordoned off for them, right? It's their empire. Nobody gets in, nobody gets out unless they approve it. And so the Starjammers basically sneaking in here is a pretty dangerous thing because the Starjammers and the Shi'ar have a pretty sketchy history, right? Going all the way back to the Phoenix of the Dark Phoenix sagas, and even before then, right? So they've been around for a long time and constantly at odds because the Starjammers are basically space pirates. And so as a result of that, Corsair kind of spits the story and basically saying, hey, look, this space station's ran by some crazy religious despot, and the result is that if you go in there, like they're gonna bust you and they're gonna take you to the torture chambers, and you gotta stay on the ship because it's really bad stuff, right? It's really, really scary out there. It's really bad stuff. The problem with Corsair is he's basically dealing with teenagers. He's dealing with teenagers here. And so as a result of that, you end up having Robert DaCosta, who goes off and grabs bourbon so they can all just basically have some drinks, which they're all probably underage, so they really shouldn't. But I wonder if space is considered international waters, like international territory, like the laws of the United States don't apply. The United States of space. For those of you guys who understand the Chappelle reference. But it's kind of a funny thing because he's like, okay, well, I'll go get some bourbon and we can take some shots. And so the result of that is that while he's gone, they all basically sneak off because they're teenagers. They do exactly what you would expect them to do, right? See, this is an important thing to understand, right? I know it seems like it may not be super important and it may not seem to be, something to focus on, the fact that they snuck out, but this is what made the New Mutants and the Generation X comics so popular. Teenagers doing teenage things. Teenagers with superpowers doing the things that they would do if they had superpowers, right? So like sneaking out at night, little things like that. I mean, it wasn't necessarily all just teenage mischief, right? There were some really, really, really amazing stories that came out of it, but it was the small little things like this that made it so cool. Danielle Moonstar kind of being the mom of the group, different things like that. It was cool how this whole thing went down. The funny thing about this is that when Robert DaCosta comes back, it reminds me of that opening scene from, or not really the opening scene, but that scene from Robin Hood Men in Tights, right? When like Robin of Locksley, who's like, hey, like I want to confess and I want to reveal everything that I've done and so on and so forth and all that kind of good stuff. And the prison guard's like, I'll go tell the warden, right? So he's like, I'm gonna get a promotion for this and everything's gonna be awesome. So he comes back, and during the time that he's gone, this leads into Robin Hood and them basically making their escape. So the guy comes back and he's like, I told the warden what was gonna happen. I'm in deep shit. which was hilarious at the time. And that's kind of what this is, right? But what you end up having here is basically them really like magic and everybody having looked at where it was the Starjammers were going to go to. And so they teleport to that location. When they get there, everything pops off. And this is when they learn the true nature of the Starjammers in terms of how they really function. As soon as the Starjammers get in and they realize the new mutants are there, then like the Starjammers are like, our job is to steal stuff. It's what we do. Like we broke in here, we stole things, and we're going to leave. And of course, a fight ends up breaking out between the new mutants and the Shi'ar soldiers who were there, and the Starjammers leave them. And that's the big thing about Corsair and his guys. They don't really care about you. If you're there and you can help them along their goal, that's cool. But if you get in the way, then they're just going to leave you hanging. And that's just the way it is. The Starjammers were almost always like that. The only real exception to that was for the most part Cyclops, Jean Grey, and some of the X-Men. And so as a result of that, you basically end up having the new mutants who are essentially cornered. And then here's the cool thing. You end up having Chamber, Jonathan Starsmore, use his powers. So for the character of Chamber, he was kind of Omega level, but kind of not. It was a little weird when it came to him. So when he originally popped up, he was basically this guy who essentially had his internal body totally destroyed by the powers that he possessed. This kind of biokinetic flame that's really a byproduct of his really of like his total psionic energy is what he is, right? Like he's a being composed of pure psychic energy that just houses a physical body. As a result of that, there was a point where really like for years and years and years, he kind of maintained this way until you got into the events of really the aftermath of House of M. And in the aftermath of House of M, he was one of the mutants who consumed some of the blood of Apocalypse in New Excalibur #9, and they became like insanely powerful. Following that, and I'm pretty sure it was after that, you went to New Mutants Volume 3, issue number 24 as part of Age of X, and basically his physical appearance was restored along with his powers, but Marvel never really seemed to clarify whether or not he kept any of the upgrades that Apocalypse gave him by virtue of the blood that he consumed. And I don't think Hickman's really answering it here. He may at some point along the line, but given the nature of New Mutants in terms of what we're seeing here, it looks like it's just classic versions of the characters, right? So it would make sense that because of the way he looks here, that he's basically classic Jonathan Starsmore, right? So just a being of pure energy that houses a physical form. It's why you see that badge, that kind of mask over his face, is because if he removes it like he does, it's just like this gaping maw inside of like his throat and his chest and so on that just emits huge forms of energy. The issue with this is he has control over it, but he hasn't reached the full potential of it, right? So the result is that he's able to kind of issue concussive blasts more or less, but it's not enough to really just like incapacitate and destroy everybody. And so following that, you end up having the Starjammers who make their way back to their ship, and they basically tell like Robert DaCosta, yeah, like we left all your friends there, man. I don't know what to tell you. Like they're all basically there, but we're getting ready to leave. Like we're leaving right now. And it's crazy because DaCosta says, well, what have they done that gives you reason to just abandon them like that? And Chode's like, they ruined my plans. And Roz is like, the chick cut off my arm. And Hepzibah's like, I don't like kids. And and Corsair's like, they took my, like you guys took my whiskey. And DaCosta's like, yeah, but like you lost that in a bet. And Corsair's like, well, now you lost a ship. So get off my ship. It's funny. Like it's these funny little moments. It's these funny little nooks and crannies and little things that make this storytelling so incredibly cool. But the cool thing about this is that once DaCosta gets to where they are, ultimately it's like, I know a really good space lawyer, a guy who can basically get us out of this. And it's kind of like, okay, so they're basically stuck here, right? Like they're captured by the Shi'ar, which really kind of begs the question, what comes next? Because for the most part, anybody who gets captured by the Shi'ar, it never really ends well. Corsair was captured by the Shi'ar along with his wife, and then like she was knocked up by, I think, Daken, and then the baby was taken out, ultimately became Vulcan. I think that's how it originally played out. Vulcan's origin is weird. There's two different origins for Vulcan. I can never remember which one's which, but things never really end well for people. And so as a result, we get this really, really cool like advertisement, which is basically like Better Call Saul. Having legal trouble, justice is blind, and so are we, space lawyer. I would watch a show based on that. But anyway, that's pretty much where it ends, guys. So this is an amazing first issue. I absolutely love it. But with that being said, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.